What's up, guys? Fooch from Fooch TV here. Now, I spoke with a buddy earlier today and he asked me, why didn't you make a video about the US election? Now, as you guys know, this is a channel about Korea and Korea social issues and whatever, everything related to Korea. So I didn't at first think it was appropriate. I did see a couple of articles talking about how Moon Jae-in last week had called Biden to wish him congratulations. I thought that was a little bit premature considering that the election hadn't been settled. Despite all of the major outlets claiming that Biden had won, the fact was that the votes weren't fully counted in some states and that there are clearly some irregularities that went on during the election that I felt should be investigated. And I felt that, Biden and the Democrats and the media, if they didn't cheat, would also want the investigation to take place to show transparency in the entire thing and to prove once and for all that no voter fraud occurred. And at least until the election had a clear result and was certified, I felt that world leaders, including Moon Jae-in, should have waited. However, he didn't. So, I didn't really think that was news to create a video. But then I thought some of the the US and Korea have a pretty big relationship together, especially when tackling North Korea. So, I went ahead and took my buddy's advice and am now making a video about this. Now, before we begin, I just want to kind of highlight the similarities between Korea and the US in terms of politics. Now, the Korean left and right are quite similar to the US left and right. The left in Korea, they want a very friendly relationship with North Korea with the hopes to reunify the countries. And they also are very pro-China. And they also want economic equality for all. Now, some of the stuff in the U.S., some of the left, such as, gay rights, rights for trans people, and mostly the kind of stuff related to that, or, less racism, or alleged less racism. Those things obviously don't really happen in Korea because Korea's not quite there yet for gay people. They're definitely not there for trans people, and because Korea is predominantly Korean, there's no really any racism. But they kind of focus on the economics, similar to the left, of economic, equality for all. So they kind of align similar to the left in the U.S. And the right in Korea are very pro-capitalism, and they kind of support Japan, and I shouldn't say support, they're in an alliance with Japan in the US. So think about the right in Korea as wanting to align with capitalism in the US and Japan, and the left in Korea wanting to align with China, North Korea, and kind of this equality for all. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first article today. We're taking a look at the Korea Jungan Daily. This, just to let you know, this is a somewhat conservative newspaper. Biden tells Moon Korea is a linchpin. Now, during the phone call that Biden had with Moon Jae-in on Thursday, Biden called Korea a linchpin for security and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific region, said the Blue House. Both of them talked for about 14 minutes together. A statement from Biden's transition team said the U.S. president-elect will work with Moon Jae-in to bolster the alliance. Biden expressed his desire to strengthen the U.S. ROK being the Republic of Korea, aka South Korea. Their alliance is the linchpin of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. It goes on to just explain ROK. The term, this is interesting, the term Indo-Pacific region was originally introduced in 2017 by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and later adopted by the Trump administration to counter growing challenges from China's rise. Now, Moon's administration has been reticent, I think I'm pronouncing that right, first time I saw that word, reticent to adopt the Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And why is that? That's because Moon Jae-in is pro-China and he's kind of sitting on the fence between the US and China, not wanting to upset China, because we've seen in the past, such as in 2016 when THAAD, which is an anti-missile system was set up on the Korean Peninsula. China got upset because THAAD's range could go into China, and as a result, China had blocked imports for South Korean products, and they also prevented Chinese from visiting South Korea. So Moon Jae-in is being very careful not to upset China, but at the same time wanting to appease the US. Now, it's going to be interesting what Biden's take is. Apparently, Trump had a top-bottom approach to solving the North Korea issue, which means that Trump himself wanted to speak with Kim Jong-un in order to form an agreement. However, obviously Biden's not in there yet, but Obama's approach was a bottom-up diplomatic approach, which is why we didn't really see any new developments between the US and North Korea during Obama's 8 years as president, and which is why North Korea seemed to be a lot friendlier with the US when Trump was willing to go and meet him, which resulted in a couple of these conferences between the two, Trump and Kim Jong-un, and it also resulted in some conferences between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. Now, Biden's approach, I'm guessing, is going to be more similar to Obama's, although we're not entirely sure yet, because before Trump, no U.S. president had met Kim Jong-un. So that may change. However, what's probably going to happen is we're probably going to see a repeat of how Obama acted towards North Korea, and we're going to see that with Biden as well. And we're not sure really what that's going to do between the relationships, because if it is more diplomatic, the U.S. is going to require, denuclearization before additional things are going to be talked about, which is probably going to result in more missile tests from North Korea, which is going to result in more sanctions towards them, which is going to deteriorate any relationship that Trump had made with North Korea. And Moon Jae-in is probably not going to be happy about that. However, honestly, North Korea doesn't really care what South Korea thinks, because essentially the country that holds the power is the U.S. And in order for the North Korea to make any big concessions, the U.S. is probably going to have to make big concessions as well. The biggest concession is removing U.S. troops from South Korea, which I don't see happening during Biden's presidency. So we're going to see now Moon Jae-in is very warm and friendly to Biden. We'll see how that relationship pans out. It should be noted that Moon Jae-in is he's in his last 2 years, I want to say. He came in as president in 2017. In Korea, presidents only have one term, and that one term is 5 years. Now, it also should be noted that the party belongs to Minjudang, or the Democratic Party. They're likely to stay in power, at least the presidential branch. And they're probably going to get another person with Minjudang elected, which are probably going to have the same goals and visions that Moon Jae-in does, since Moon Jae-in has definitely vitalized the Democratic Party. So it'll be interesting to see, if Biden takes Obama's approach, which is more sanctions and not speaking to Kim Jong-un, how Kim Jong-un will react to the U.S. and South Korea. And if it's unfavorable, we might see even a larger shift away from the U.S. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing I want to talk about is this is actually really fascinating, is that earlier this year in April, there wasn't a presidential election in South Korea. However, there was an election for the National Assembly. Now, the National Assembly, think of it as Congress and Senate combined. In Korea, it's just it's the National Assembly and the presidency and the Supreme Court. Now, as I was walking around in certain areas in Korea, especially Gangnam, I saw a protest from people on the right accusing voter fraud from happening exactly in a similar fashion, or exactly the same way that accusations in the US of voter fraud was happening from the right. So it's quite interesting that both the Korean National Assembly election and the US presidential election have accusations of voter fraud from the Conservative Party, and a lot of them are blaming China. Let's take a look at this article right now. Before Trump, South Korean conservatives also claimed a stolen election. Today's right-wing politics has a transitional a transnational element resulting in eerily similar conspiracy theories about voter fraud in the US and South Korea. So as you can see, the article I picked here, it's either quite liberal or they're just shutting down any accusations of voter fraud happening in South Korea. I haven't looked at the evidence for the South Korean voter fraud myself. However, I have a couple of friends, very intelligent individuals. They've graduated from the #1 school in South Korea, being Seoul National University. Much smarter than I am, and they say that they've taken a look at the evidence, and it's quite clear that election fraud had occurred in South Korea in the April election for the National Assembly. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I'm not saying that's false. Let's take a look at what this article has to say. I'm going down here. So this year in the U.S. election, there's obviously mail-in ballots as a result of a fear of the coronavirus or COVID-19, whatever you want to call it. There was a fear, so there was a lot of mail-in ballots and there was a lot of in-person voting, and the claim for voter fraud came from the mail-in ballots were either for Trump were either being thrown out, or I think the one that there is evidence, a USPS postal worker had come out with Project Veritas and blew the whistle on the USPS, saying that mail was being backdated to the prior or to up until the election date, so it would be counted in Pennsylvania. Now, quite similarly, as a result of the coronavirus, for the National Assembly elections in South Korea, they didn't have mail-in ballots because in Korea, I just found out you have to vote in person. You cannot send in an absentee ballot every time you vote, including abroad. It has to be in person. So if you're a Korean citizen living in another country and you're still voting for an election, you have to go into the embassy and prove your identity. So they're quite strong, or they're quite strict with that rule. But in Korea, instead of having the absentee ballots, what they did was they had 2 extra days of voting, which it's not common. I want to say it hasn't been done before. I'm not 100% sure, but it's definitely uncommon. And they had 2 extra days of voting that happened before the actual election. So we see South Korea's April election saw a record 26.7% of voters casting their ballots in advance, with the National Election Commission and the political parties encouraging voters to do so amidst the pandemic, mostly from the left, of course. Similar to the U.S., voters who voted early favored the progressives. For instance, in Seoul, the Democratic Party led the United Future Party by 26. The Democratic Party being the left, United Future Party being the conservatives or the right, or the Republic equivalent. The United Future Party by 26.76% in advance voting, while the margin was reduced to 1.35% in regular voting. Also, the ballots cast in advance were counted after the regular votes, which is kind of weird. You would think that because they were casting the votes in person, similar to the votes done on the day of the election, that they would be counted at the same time, since they were, or at least you would think they would be counted ahead of time, but apparently they were counted after the regular votes. Again, this website is debunking or trying to debunk or trying to say that every accusation of voter fraud in South Korea during the National Assembly election, they're trying to say that they're conspiracy theories. So, I mean, the site saying that they're conspiracy theories, or admitting to the fact that they were counted after the regular vote. So several races where the United Future Party was leading flipped at the last minute. So the Republicans, or not Republicans, the right conservatives in Korea were winning, and then after they counted the early votes, they flipped at the last minute, similar to Pennsylvania and Georgia in the U.S. election. Shortly after the election, Min, who was a National Assembly member who used to be prominent in the media, and he lost his seat during the election. Min publicized far right. Everything's far right or alt right now. If you don't believe the narrative, if you have any doubt at all, you're automatically far right, alt right, which is supposed to immediately disenfranchise anyone who's reading the article or create mistrust that these people are clearly crazy, which is not true. If there are irregularities, they should be investigated. Min publicized far right conspiracy theories about the election that had been circulating on the internet. He pointed out that the ballot boxes containing advanced voting ballots were stored in places without CCTVs and highlighted the discrepancy between the results of the early and regular voting. Mitt obtained crushed ballots, some of them believed to be stapled by the authorities, from an observer and presented them as further evidence of election tampering. He also problematized the QR codes on advanced voting ballots, suggesting that these contain the personally identifiable information from 5 million Korean citizens, including records on criminal activities, military service, tax payments, and so forth. I've heard also other theories saying that these machines, which were not supposed to be connected to the internet, were connected to the internet, and there apparently is proof. Again, I'm not saying that there is evidence. I'm not saying that there's not evidence. I'm saying that there are irregularities that popped up in both the Korean and U.S. election. And similar to the U.S. election, it seemed like a lot of people, or at least the people on the left in the media, did not want to investigate, and has apparently been ignored since the election. And after, this was back in April, now it's November, a lot of people have lost interest in the issue as what normally happens with humans, especially with so many news stories popping up. Naturally, people lose interest, so this kind of dropped this issue. However, again, I have some pretty intelligent friends here that they are conservative, and they truly believe that there was some sort of election fraud that happened in Korea. Similar to in the US, some of my very intelligent friends have also stated that they believe that there are irregularities and they should be investigated. And I think the important thing here is that if there are irregularities and there is doubt, we need to investigate, and it's kind of alarming and it's kind of suspicious why these investigations are not taking place. As I mentioned earlier, the right resembles the right, or the right resembles the right in the US, and the left in Korea resembles the left in the US. So a lot of the people on the left, the Minjudang supporters, they were extremely happy that Biden won. They really don't like Trump, even though they originally did back in 2018 when Trump was willing to talk to North Korea, thinking that Trump really wanted to bring the Koreas together. However, after talks fell through, they chalked it up to Trump wanting to have, higher approval ratings in the U.S., and they didn't actually really care about Korea. So they're quite happy that Biden won. And people on the right in Korea are very upset, considering they are very pro-capitalism and they support the U.S. and Japan. They're anti-China, and they felt, that Trump really aligned with what they support. And they're also accusing voter fraud in the U.S. So Koreans on the right, conservative Koreans in Korea, not all of them, a good portion of them, are also accusing voter fraud in the U.S. election. There you have it. That's my take on the U.S. election and kind of tying it in with stuff happening here in Korea. If you like this video, make sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you want me to talk more about politics, let me know. Or if there are any other topics that you want me to talk more about, let me know. Leave a comment below. Also, leave a comment below if you think that there was voter fraud either in the U.S. election or the Korean election, or you strongly believe that there was no voter fraud. Until next time, I will catch you guys later.